workers in this fight for getting corporate greed out of the healthcare system. My great partner, Senator Warren, Congresswoman Trahan will be joining us, along with the Massachusetts Nurses Association and SEIU 1199, the workers at these hospitals. On April 3rd, I held a hearing with Senator Warren at the Massachusetts State House for my subcommittee on primary health and retirement security to highlight the harms of corporate greed in healthcare in the United States. At that hearing, there were 5 witness seats. 4 of them were filled with health providers. They were powerful witnesses who spoke about the dangers of corporate executives gutting hospitals to hoard wealth at the expense of the public's health. But one witness chair remained empty. It was the seat left open for Dr. Ralph DeLatorre, CEO of Steward Healthcare. I invited him 3 times to testify. He declined each and every time. At the time, Steward was not in bankruptcy, but the symptoms of Steward's severe financial distress were clear. I visited Good Samaritan Hospital in Brockton and heard from health workers struggling as emergency lines grew. New England Sinai Hospital in Stoughton closed. Sanjia Rashid, a patient at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, died when an essential medical device was missing because Steward couldn't pay its vendors. Now, 5 months later, Dr. Ralph DeLatorre is denying a subpoena issued by my committee. He is trying to shield himself behind a letter written by corporate lawyers who claim he cannot testify because of the bankruptcy proceedings. There was no bankruptcy 5 months ago when he declined to testify before my subcommittee. Ralph DeLatorre's excuses are as empty as his chair was at my April 3rd hearing. He is in hiding because he does not want to answer to the American people or Congress or the patients and workers of Massachusetts for what he has done. He wants to hide from the accountability of what the last 5 months have exposed. His decision to invite Cerebus Capital Management and Medical Properties Trust into the health care system of Massachusetts and allowed the private equity firm to walk away with at least $800 million. And Medical Properties Trust and private equity firm Apollo Global Management will continue to collect rent from Steward hospitals across the country and Massachusetts. While hospitals here in Massachusetts and across the country fell into debt, Ralph DeLatorre and Steward executives paid themselves millions and apparently spent hospital money to spy on their critics and enact fraudulent international money-making efforts in Malta. And as health workers at Steward hospitals begged for support, Ralph DeLatorre sailed on yachts he purchased during all of this, flew on private jets, purchased multi-million-dollar homes, and took lavish trips to Versailles, and as the Boston Globe Spotlight team highlighted this week, used his children's own elite school as a scheme to make even more money for himself. But the hospitals he extracted money from didn't simply struggle. Some of them failed. Kearney Hospital in the Neshoba Valley closed just last week, ending those communities' institutions and jeopardizing the livelihoods of the many people who made it their life's work to save lives. People may die because of these closures, and the responsibility for that falls squarely on the leadership of Steward Healthcare, including Ralph DeLatorre. Doctors are supposed to serve their patients, but the only people Dr. DeLatorre appears to have served are himself and his corporate executive cronies. When I voted on July 25th to issue the first subpoena from the Senate Health Committee since 1981, it was not a request for Ralph DeLatorre to answer for what he's done. It was a demand that he answer for what he has done. It was a demand that 15 of my bipartisan colleagues joined because Dilatore's cruel disregard for patients and workers in Massachusetts, Louisiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, and Texas is flagrant. Ralph Dilatore has shown contempt for our healthcare system. And now the United States Senate must bring contempt charges against Ralph Dilatore. This means that the Senate Health Committee must vote to hold Dilatore in criminal or civil contempt, or both, and then the full Senate must vote to refer this recommendation to haul Dilatore into court. Contempt means that if he continues to refuse to appear before the committee, we will not stop until he answers for what he has done or is put behind bars. But we will not stop there. Steward Healthcare is not an exception. It is an example of a broader pattern of how corporate greed costs lives. Greedy corporate executives recklessly pillage the healthcare system on behalf of themselves and their investors. And when the dollar comes first, patients always come last. This is unacceptable. We must create permanent reform that puts patients first at every level of healthcare. We must pass my Health Over Wealth Act so that CEO no longer stands for criminally exploitative officers in our healthcare system. To Dr. Dilatore, I say this directly. You cannot hide in your Texas mansion. You cannot hide behind your corporate lawyers. You will be made accountable by the United States Senate for what you have done. You will be held accountable for the harm you have inflicted on people here in Massachusetts and across the country. You should be held in contempt if you fail to appear. You should be fired from your position as CEO. You should lose your medical degree. And the millions that you made off with of Steward should go back to repairing the healthcare system which you broke. The history books will list you as the poster child for why we created permanent reform, why we need permanent reform to guard against greedy corporate CEOs in the healthcare system of the United States of America. So now let me turn and introduce my great colleague, Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Thank you, Senator Markey, and thank you very much for your leadership on this. A congressional subpoena is exceedingly rare, but it is a legal order, not an invitation, an order. Yesterday, we learned through his lawyer that Ralph Dilatore is saying he will refuse to obey a lawfully issued subpoena. Ralph Dilatore is one more rich guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him. He seems to think he's above the law and that he can take whatever he wants and not have to answer for any of the destruction that he leaves behind. Ralph Dilatore spent nearly 20 years sucking every last bit of value out of the Steward hospitals. He is the one constant in this whole sordid affair, from the moment private equity bought out the hospitals through Steward's bankruptcy, the closure of Kearney and Neshoba Valley hospitals, and the sale of the other hospitals. Throughout it all, as the hospitals got poorer, Mr. Dilatore got richer. So where is he now that he has been subpoenaed to testify before Congress? On one of his 2 private yachts, at the vacation home he renovated on Steward Healthcare's dime, or maybe he's back in Versailles. Ralph Dilatore's lawyer says that Mr. Dilatore can't talk because the hearing will be turned into a pseudo-criminal proceeding. Based on the facts gathered in yesterday's Spotlight report in the Boston Globe, it is entirely possible that Mr. Dilatore's looting of Steward may have involved significant criminal activity. But that is not an excuse for ignoring a subpoena. Congress has questions to ask, and if Mr. Delatorre believes the answers will put him at risk for going to jail, he can take the Fifth Amendment right out in public for everyone to see. Congress has oversight responsibilities and important questions to ask that will help guide future legislative decisions. The Senate should enforce its subpoena with a contempt citation. If Mr. Delatorre continues to resist, federal marshals can arrest him and bring him before the committee. If Mr. Delatorre wants to try to weasel out of responsibility, he will have to do that in public. That is what the subpoena demands. Ralph Delatorre's greed may be boundless, but he's not the only private equity pirate in the sea. It is essential that we pass legislation to protect our healthcare system from these robbers. Senator Markey and I introduced the Corporate Crimes Against Healthcare Act so that the next time greedy executives can't wreak havoc and then hide out like Dr. Delatorre has done. Our bill is designed to make certain that what happened with Steward never happens again. Executives that drive a healthcare system like Steward into bankruptcy, threatening the lives of patients and costing communities the care they rely on, those executives under our bill can be held personally liable. Our bill also gives the Department of Justice and state attorneys general the power to claw back ill-gotten gains. Law enforcement authorities need to investigate Dr. Delatorre for possible criminal activities, and we need to change the law to make sure that the next set of greedy private equity firms and healthcare executives can't inflict the same damage on the people of our Commonwealth. Thank you.
Beautiful. And now we'll hear from Congresswoman Laurie Trahan, who's been the leader on fighting what is happening up at Neshoba.
Thank you. It's great to join all of you today with Senators Warren and Markey, Tim and Ellen. Thank you so much. We stand together in support of the communities that we're proud to represent, communities that have been devastated by the actions of Steward Healthcare executives, right with Ralph Delatorre at the top. In my district, hospitals like Neshoba Valley Medical Center and Air and Holy Family Hospitals in Methuen and Haverhill serve as vital lifelines for families. These are not just medical facilities. They are pillars of our communities, providing essential care for hardworking families who rely on that care being close to their home. The families that depend on these hospitals, they need the care to access easily. And when that access is threatened, it's not just an inconvenience, it's a matter of life or death. Executives at Steward Health knew this, and yet they chose to prioritize profits over patient care anyway. The private equity business model that they implemented has driven these hospitals into financial ruin. This was done not out of necessity, but so that a few could line their pockets, executives enriching themselves while our hospitals suffer. When the financial crisis at Steward first came to light, I received an outpouring of concern from my communities. One resident told me that Neshoba Valley Medical Center saved his life 25 years ago. Another shared how her elderly parents, longtime residents of Neshoba, or patients of Neshoba, would struggle to reach the next nearest hospital. These are not just stories. They reflect the real human cost of these decisions. When the people's representatives in Congress appealed to Ralph Delatorre to come before them to help ensure that no scenario like this would ever come to pass again, he dodged. Unfortunately, even without his physical presence in Washington, we know how bad this situation is. As the Boston Spotlight revealed, Steward's financial misconduct was even more severe than we had feared. Executives funneled millions out of hospital accounts using funds meant for patient care to fuel lavish personal expenditures from private jets to luxury yachts. And throughout it all, there was no sense of responsibility or remorse. Steward's attempt to shift blame for the closure of hospitals like Neshoba Valley onto the state is unconscionable and unacceptable. The truth is clear. This crisis was created by those at the top, not by external factors, and it is our duty to hold them accountable. That's why I've called on the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Federal Trade Commission to expand their investigations into Steward Health's actions. Additionally, I'm advocating for the passage for the federal essential health system designation to better protect community hospitals and ensure that they remain accessible in their communities. The people responsible for this crisis, they must be held accountable for the harm that they have caused. And we will continue to fight to ensure that justice is served and accessible health and emergency care is accessible to residents in the Neshoba Valley and beyond. I want to thank the senators, my state and local partners in the effort. I want to thank the SEIU and the MNA for rallying us around not only what the patients are feeling right now, but also the hardworking staff and the providers who are also have been left in the lurch by this devastating action. Thank you.
Beautiful. Excellent. Thank you. And now we're going to hear from Tim Foley, who speaks for all of the SEIU workers in our state.
Good morning still. My name is, well, first I want to thank Senator Warren and Senator Markey and Congressman Trahan for all their support and leadership, as well as the MNA, through this very difficult time that we've all been going through as it relates to Steward Healthcare. As the Senator said, my name is Tim Foley. I'm the Executive Vice President of 1199 SEIU. We're a healthcare workers union representing over 85,000 hospital, nursing home, and home care workers throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and represent nearly 5,000 workers throughout the Steward Healthcare system. Workers who have stood together during this very difficult time to do their job, to provide high-quality community health care services for the residents of Massachusetts and beyond. And I think we all owe them a great debt of thank you and gratitude for the struggles that they have had to go through to continue to deliver that care during this very difficult time. Since Steward Healthcare filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the healthcare workers of 1199, along with many of the folks here with me today, including the MNA and others, have really stayed focused on three main priorities. One is to continue to provide quality healthcare services at community hospitals throughout the Steward system, to fight to maintain operations and to keep all hospitals open during the bankruptcy proceedings. Clearly, the Neshoba Valley and Kearney are two significant issues that we need to be addressed, and we look forward to working with the Congresswoman and others on solutions so that residents in those areas have access to community health care services, and that fight continues. And our third priority was to maintain quality health care jobs throughout the Steward healthcare system. And as we start to see the Chapter 11 bankruptcy proceedings come to a conclusion, with good news yesterday that 6 hospitals were in fact sold or authorized to be sold to new operators, our time and attention now focuses on accountability. That Ralph Della Torre and Steward Healthcare and their investment partners and all the CEOs involved need to be held accountable for their actions, accountable to the communities in which their hospitals have closed and they're trying to figure out what to do for healthcare access, accountability to patients who right now are trying to figure out where do they go to receive care, what do they do in a case of emergency, and accountability for workers. Accountability for workers like Lori, who works in the Neshoba Valley and had to say goodbye to her psych patients she's cared for over 20 years. Workers like Narkia Washington, who spent 20 years as a patient access rep at Kearney Medical Center, who decided to leave healthcare because of how she's been treated and the situation she had to go through working for Steward. And accountability for workers like Carl Odom and Maureen Raitt, who has spent 45 years working at Kearney Hospital and now are fighting just to keep the severance that they've earned and spent years dedicated service to the hospital to earn so they could retire with respect. Well, we know all the issues have been highlighted in the Spotlight series of the excess and greed that has led to that being a very difficult situation for these workers. And so we stand ready as healthcare workers of 1199 SEIU with our partners here today and others who are not to demand accountability for the greed and for sucking the life out of these hospitals for their own personal gain. Well, workers are suffering, communities are suffering, and patients are suffering, and we look forward to that, to hold them accountable for their actions so that there can be justice for these communities, for these workers, for these patients. And I thank all the leaders here today and look forward to the conversation in the future to bring just that to these workforce. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, so much. And Now we're going to hear from Ellen McGinnis, representing the Massachusetts Nurses Association. Welcome.
Thank you, Senator. Just to be clear, I'm the amateur up here. Thank you, Senator Markey, for inviting me to speak this morning. Thank you to the entire Mass delegation for all you've done to support the communities, the nurses, the health professionals, and dedicated workers who have been negatively impacted by the Stewart crisis. As a nurse who's given decades of service at St. Elizabeth's Medical Center right here in Boston, and on behalf of the 2,800 plus nurses and health professionals who've been forced to endure the slings and arrows of Ralph de la Torre's outrageous fortune, I come today to share disgust at this loathsome behavior and to register our support for any and all efforts you can muster to hold this greedy coward accountable for the suffering he has caused and the damage he has done to our healthcare system here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. While he sailed on his yachts, flew in his jets, vacationed around the world, those of us in the trenches of his depleted and embattled hospitals were forced to care for patients in understaffed units with broken and missing equipment, missing supplies, where nurses were brought in their own food to feed diabetic patients at night when the kitchen was closed and we had no options. And where an innocent mother died because the piece of equipment that could have saved her life had been repossessed by an unpaid vendor. As Ralph lived his life of the rich and famous, our patients, many of them the poorest and most vulnerable among us, saw services they needed eliminated or severely diminished. The irony of all this is that he started his misbegotten empire of greed with the purchase of hospitals like mine, created with the purpose and mission to care for the least among us. The good news is that for some of the hospitals, there's a new future under responsible ownership. We won't be being run by the frat house that is Stewart anymore. And while the two communities totally deprived of their access of care as a result of this unbridled greed and corporate shenanigans. So we do our best to rebuild our hospitals for our communities. We leave it to you, those with the power to do so, to hold this man accountable for all his misdeeds. And that someday we will see him not in surgical scrubs, not in an Armani suit, but where he belongs, behind bars, dressed in an orange prison jumpsuit. Thank you.
Good job.
That was good.
Good job. No, excellent. Any questions?
Senator Markey, about next steps, does the committee have a contempt vote plan? Is it something you're still talking to colleagues about? What happens now?
Yeah, right now, Senator Sanders and I are working with Republicans to put together a plan to vote a contempt citation against Ralph de la Torre. So we're planning on that. We got the notice yesterday that he refuses to appear. We will have a hearing regardless next week with an empty chair where he would have sat, and we'll have witnesses that come from the affected communities who will sit in their chairs to testify, this time not in the Massachusetts State House, but in the capital of the United States, so that his story can be told across our country as a warning of what can happen when private equity takes over nonprofit healthcare systems in our nation and turns them into private piggy banks for themselves. So our goal is to ensure that as Ralph de la Torre held the healthcare system of Massachusetts in contempt, that the United States Senate will hold him in contempt if he refuses to testify.
Senator, how quickly do you think contempt charges will be brought?
Well, we're moving as rapidly as we can. We're going to continue to have our hearing next week as was planned, and we will work with our Republican colleagues who, by the way, voted 16-4 to have this hearing next week. so that we can continue on a bipartisan basis. This isn't just a story about Massachusetts. It's a story about Louisiana. It's a story about state after state across the country who have suffered from the example which he began here in Massachusetts. He is the continuation of the entire story. He's been the CEO of Steward from its very origins. So only he knows the totality of the story, which is why he should be there, because it has spread to other states. It's spread to other countries as well under his leadership.
Senator Warren, do you think De La Torre has committed a crime, and are you aware of any federal investigation going on of him criminally?
So I can't speak to whether the facts as reported would constitute a crime, but I can say in the abstract that anyone who takes money out of a corporation and uses it for personal gain and fails to report it as income and pay taxes on it would be in violation of the law. And anyone who ran a corporation that was taking money out for personal uses and not accounting for it properly in the bookkeeping would be committing a crime. It's a books and records crime. You may remember that Donald Trump was convicted of 34 felonies based on books and records of the corporation that were inaccurate. When I saw the Spotlight story yesterday, it revealed a lot of information that had not yet been made public, and it certainly raises questions that would appropriately trigger an investigation of Mr. De La Torre and all of his executive management team.
And the Boston Globe has reported that there is a grand jury that has been impaneled, federal grand jury, to investigate. So I don't know what the nature of that specific grand jury investigation is, but it does indicate that right now there is a very serious investigation that's underway according to the Globe Spotlight team. Questions? Yes.
You represent the towns that will be most affected by the Neshoba Valley closure. Do you think that the state should be looking at options similar to what it did for St. Elizabeth's for Neshoba Valley? Should it be looking at eminent domain, other options? Do you have any calls to the legislature to government healing?
Yeah, so I'll first start by saying, we really do think, but because I'm from or represent an affected community, I kind of think about this in a number of ways. One is, how are we going to reopen Neshoba Valley Medical Center under new leadership as quickly as possible? There is a real concern in the Neshoba Valley and heading out to the central, western region of the state, in my district, that's going to become a healthcare desert if more isn't done to sort of put back into place the emergency care, maternal care that we've seen, and just the services that families and communities have come to rely on. There wasn't a qualified bid, during the bankruptcy proceedings to keep Neshoba Valley, and so eminent domain was not an option. I can tell you I am on daily phone calls with the governor, the secretary, and our state and local leaders, as well as providers and nurses, physicians groups. And we are exhausting all options in terms of, trying to get those proposals. I mean, certainly things change between when bankruptcy proceedings end and kind of going forward. We need to make sure that as we reopen services, they're going to be services that can be sustained. That is, what we're exploring now. But I'm quite optimistic, given the people who are working on this issue and have really understand what the community is going through, that we're going to find a solution and we're going to find a way to reopen Neshoba Valley. And then the other ways I look at this, because I am so focused on sort of reopening, but also the accountability, which I'm so grateful that the senators are taking a lead in this subpoena and holding Ralph De La Torre accountable. Certainly investigations by the DOJ, the FTC, HHS, because he has been such a bad actor and it has been so well documented. And then certainly as any crisis is how are we going to shore up our laws to make sure that this never happens again? And I think that's being done on a state level and certainly a federal level. I mean, this private equity model that wreaks havoc from greedy corporate executives on families, hardworking families who are just trying to access their health care, is sort of the best motivation for us to shore up whatever authorities that we need to hold people accountable or laws to not even let them set up shop to begin with. Thank you.
Mr. Foley and sorry, I mean, can you talk about, you said like 1,200 people thrown out of work between the closures of the two hospitals. Can you talk at all about efforts to place your members, efforts to sort of give them as soft a landing as possible?
So for the nurses and professional healthcare bargaining unit members of the M&A, we have provided all open positions in Stewart, and ideally people would carry with them their seniority and their differentials and all that. There are a lot of openings. Stewart has been abysmal at filling openings. And some folks are just retiring. Connie had a lot of nurses. Elaine Graves, their co-chair, had been there 48 years. People were very committed to the hospital, and they're just ready to be done. But that's what the M&A has done.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's clearly, as I stated earlier, a huge impact on these hospital closures, not just in the community and the access to care, but also to the workers who have dedicated much of their life to working for those institutions. So 1199 right now is in active conversations around how to deal with two important issues. The closure agreement that we need to reach with the employer as it relates to paid time off benefits and severance that they are owed contractually, as well as just because they've spent their whole careers working for these institutions. We have yet to reach an agreement on that. We're hopeful that we can win some version of severance for these workers. Like I said, Carl owed him 45 years, Kearney Hospital, ready to retire, and is owed 45 years of severance. And so we're trying to work on those issues so people can make decisions of what they want to do with their lives and their career. Additionally, we, along with the M&A, are currently trying to place as many workers as we can into open positions throughout the Stewart healthcare system. There are many. As Ellen said, there was, I think, 1,500 openings across much of the Stewart healthcare system. Finding the right fit for people, the schedule, is clearly going to be very disruptive to their lives, particularly in the Neshoba Valley Hospital. There is not has been a concern about the healthcare desert and access to emergency rooms. The closest hospital is 20 miles plus away, which has big disruptions on people who have to pick up their kids at the end of the day or the schedule that they've had for many years. And so we're trying to find the right fit for them. I have to give a lot of credit to the governor and her team and Secretary Jones with the rapid response team who's been there with doing community health fairs and job fairs for folks so they can try to find placement. And clearly the WARN Act, which is an important law passed at the federal level to ensure workers are paid through at least the 24th of September and they maintain health insurance through the 30th of September. And so we're doing everything in our power to protect our members and their rights and what they've earned during their careers and to find jobs in healthcare for those that want to remain. Like I mentioned earlier, Narkia Washington has spent her years of service in Stewart, and because of her experience, wants to leave healthcare, and that's not good for anyone. And so we're hoping to place as many workers as we can and win their benefits that they are owed.
Senator, could you speak to whether you're leaning towards civil or criminal contempt charges and the relative, say, advantages or disadvantages of that?
Well, we're working with the Republicans to ensure that we are doing this with the strongest possible bipartisan message, that this conduct is not acceptable. So that's the goal that Senator Sanders has. That's the goal which I have. There clearly is a great interest on the part of the Republicans on the Senate Health Committee to move. We'll determine what the best pathway is over the course of the next week. I think to some extent the hearing that we have next week, Senator Warren and I will be there to make sure that there is an accountability, that empty chair is going to be held accountable for, but all of the other members of our committee will be hearing these stories from the workers, from the affected communities, not just in Massachusetts, but all across the country. And I think in that context, we'll be able to come to the best decision as to whether a civil or criminal penalty is appropriate. But in either case, he will be made accountable. Both of them actually wind up with him having to serve jail time if he does not comply.
What has to happen for the workers to get the severance?
We have to reach an agreement with the employer.
Yeah, come on over,
Okay,
Tim.
yeah. The process.
Employer being
Stewart Healthcare. So right now we are in negotiations around the closure agreement with the union. They have to negotiate the terms of that, and so we are in conversations now to try to reach that agreement around the paid time off that is owed as well as the severance that's owed.
And it has to be approved by the bankruptcy.
Yes, of course, yeah. And
This
bankruptcy,
is no longer an open negotiation.
yeah, we're negotiating on the terms, and they submit it for approval to the bankruptcy court.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I was wondering if there's going to be any kind of monitoring of the outcomes for people who may or may not have access to health care, if there's any deaths that are related or bad outcomes that are related to the closings?
Well, I've been working on this issue for the entirety of this year, and I'm not going away. So I will continue to have the hearings, to conduct the investigations, which are necessary in order to make sure that there is a full understanding of the consequences of Ralph DeLatorre and Stewart's actions. We are going to document it so that we can understand what proper restitution looks like, proper help for the workers and for the patients that have been left behind. So this is still an ongoing story. We've just reached the next phase of it, but it's not going to end until we ensure that all of the stories are told and that there is accountability and, to the maximum extent possible, restitution to those who have been harmed.
Yeah. Can I just add
Yeah,
on
sure,
that?
sure, please.
This is a task for our state public health department to track health outcomes as the consequence of closing 2 hospitals. I have spoken with our first responders who have made clear that the echo effects from closing an emergency room will be felt throughout the system. They talk about how ambulances end up having to travel further, and when they get to the closest emergency room, the lines are longer to unload those ambulances and get care for those patients. That means the ambulances are off the road and not able to respond to other emergencies. So tracking the long-term health consequences of closing 2 hospitals here in Massachusetts is an important undertaking for our Massachusetts Department of Health and an important undertaking nationally.
I have one more for Congresswoman Trahan.
Yeah, please.
I know you're trying to keep the Neshoba open, but given that
Reopen.
it's private property, right, and given that it's a federal bankruptcy court, isn't it going to be sold to the highest bidder? And if a real estate developer wants to put a mall in there, that could happen. Are you limited in what you can do?
So you're absolutely right. Like, everyone is deathly scared of the scenario where it's not reopened. But I think the state has taken a leadership role in talking to potential bidders in terms of what services can be reopened. I mean, look, I think one of the things that is a casualty when you have such greed sort of pulling money out of these systems. One of the reasons why there wasn't a qualified bidder for Neshoba Valley is because that facility was run into the ground. We heard from more than a few bidders that it's like the cost of having to, reinvest was too great. And so, thinking about how we're going to take, services that are vital in the emergency room, which we've heard overwhelmingly from EMS and from the community. How are we going to reopen that and maybe some other vital services that people have come to rely on is really what the state is looking to find a partner here, and there have been several that have come to the table to see post-bankruptcy. Is there a path forward? And the one other thing that I will say just on the last question is the state's been incredible. The State Department of Public Health, they came to community meetings. They knew all the way down to the gas mileage how much it was going to impact local EMS. So the data is going to be there for us to hold folks accountable going forward in terms of lives lost, God forbid, but even what these other systems are going to have to handle or take on in terms of a surge and what those EMS providers. And one of the things the Department of Public Health did just very, they outfitted our EMS, our ambulances, with more life-saving equipment so that, this has been underfunded for a long time, but now they at least have the ability en route when they're traveling 40 minutes to Leominster or to Emerson to have the equipment needed to stabilize folks. And so I just have to also take my hat off to the state because they have been such a great partner given the constraints that they've been having to work under.
I just want to mention one more constraint that the Congresswoman was talking about, that under De La Torre, these hospitals had been driven into the ground. De La Torre has been left in charge, not only all through this 20-year process, but through the bankruptcy. So he is the person who has been engaging in the negotiations over which hospitals will be closed, which will be left open, what constitutes a qualified bid. Now, to be sure, there has been some oversight from the bankruptcy court, but it has been De La Torre who has stayed right at the central pivot point on every decision that has been made going forward. I believe he should have already been replaced by a trustee in bankruptcy, someone whose job is not only to make sure that the employees and the public have access to all the information, but also someone whose job it is to investigate De La Torre and actually pull back some of the assets that De La Torre has taken out of the steward chain. And that simply has not happened. This contempt, we're not at a contempt citation. This refusal to acknowledge the subpoena should be grounds for having him replaced as the person in charge of the Steward Hospital system. I understand it's way late in the process, but I'd like to see someone else who gets their eyes on all of the information that's happening confidentially, internally, and not disclosed to the public. Someone besides Ralph De La Torre.
Who should do that? The bankruptcy court judge?
Yes, but it takes a creditor to make the motion to make that happen.
So we're going to proceed to next week and then beyond. It's a national story. Ralph De La Torre took the 8 hospitals in Massachusetts and then leveraged it so that he could then move to purchase 22 other hospitals in the United States, and then to move on to Malta internationally, where he is under criminal charges in Malta as well. So to the extent to which we are going to continue to proceed aggressively, insistently, persistently, and consistently until we get the answers, it is that Senator Cassidy, the ranking member of the Health Committee, is from Louisiana. And he's got a hospital in Louisiana that's affected by this. This is a national story. It's an international story. It's a story about private equity. It's a story about how they are treating a healthcare system across Massachusetts, the country, and internationally, as though it's a widget company, as though it's any other kind of company in the United States. It's not. Healthcare is special. We can see the impact on the communities. We can see the impact on the healthcare that is provided. So that's why we're going to proceed. We're going to do so aggressively, and we're not going to stop until Ralph De La Torre is made accountable to the people of Massachusetts and our country.
Is it time for Medicare for all? Is it time for single payer universal health care?
100%. But in the meantime, we're going to make Ralph De La Torre accountable for what he has done.